You better be listening to Sleazoids or I must break you.
There's a good boy. Tell your father his dinner's on the table.
It's not on the table.
It's not on the table.
Well, it will be by the time you get him out of that park.
Dad?
Dad?
You're both murderers.
We're both murderers.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
Next week, we are going Stephen King mode, but we are going trashy Stephen King mode, so join that sleaze.
Yeah, we decide on all the official ratings and rankings of every film that we cover as well. Patreon subscribers also get an honor shout out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we are in, I believe, our 7th year of.
Yeah.
So there's like 180 plus bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series where we talk about new release genre films, which there's over 50 of now. So yeah, we're going to hit 250 bonus episodes at some point during this year. If you're interested in that, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. And speaking of which, we had a bunch of people make the jump this week, so we're going to give them their shout outs real quick here. We had Uberlane Gizbar sign up at $5 a month, Matt McDowell, Alistair Brown, Turd666, thank you for that, Jack, Max Pomerantz, Matt McDowell, Vincent T, Harry Likes Batman, Charlie Catone, Ray Costello, Ryan Greenlaw, Jack McGraw, Christian Flynn, who actually signed up at the annual tier and got a little bit of a monthly discounted rate for getting an entire year of the show in advance. We had Joseph Turchinsky sign up at $5 a month, Wesley, Ryan McNabb, Tom Christensen, Calvin Vaughn, Lauren Corner, Margilinium, Jonathan Johnson, Peter Duarte, Eepel, and last but not least, Glafira May. So thanks to all of you folks. Hope you're enjoying all those bonus episodes. We appreciate that support.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
That's the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you were listening on either one of those platforms, and we can see the stats, we can see you right now listening on both those platforms, give us a good old rating or review over there. It helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners. And the last plug, as always, is merch. If you like the poster art that based out of Toronto horror artist Trevor Henderson did for our show, you can get that put on basically anything that you can think of. And you freaks have thought of a lot of stuff. You have bought notebooks, pillows, coffee mugs, hoodies. If you're interested in anything like that, the link is in the description of this episode, as well as over at sleazoidspodcast.com. But that is it for the intro. Welcome back another week. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, is my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome. I believe 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks over on the main feed would have heard from us, where we would have had special returning guest Eddie Averill of the Extended Clip podcast on to discuss some non-Unforgiven entries in the Clint Eastwood self-reflective and self-implicating deconstructionist, kind of too old for this shit run of 1990s masterpieces that he went on. We talked about White Hunter Black Heart, which was his very personal and psychological and sort of metafictional portrait of John Huston during his time apparently becoming self-destructively obsessed with big game hunting while making The African Queen. And we paired it with his 1993 film A Perfect World, which was his very sneakily complex and meditative and kind of heart-wrenching criminal kidnapping manhunt procedural that's kind of also just like a buddy hangout road movie between Kevin Costner and a kid. But it gets at a lot of bleak things about fathers and sons and the justice system, and it gets to some pretty melodramatic places.
Yeah, watching a Costner kind of play a duality of the really hardened criminal and then trying to play a father figure is fantastic. And specifically love that extended ending that Eastwood does in A Perfect World, where it just feels way longer than it needs to be. It's like a
45-minute long climax.
Yeah, and he balances so many different tones. He actually is kind of lighthearted while being so kind of like having such a devastating ending. So it's fantastic stuff. Both movies great.
Yeah, so we haven't heard that episode. That was 2 weeks ago over on the main feed. We had fun talking about those with Eddie. But then last week, exclusively on the Patreon for the patrons, we decided to do a double feature of very stylish and tragic French jewelry store heist noirs, both featuring 30-minute long, wordless, Bressonian, process-based heist sequences. Yes, there are two movies that fit that to a T, and they were Jules Dassin's Fifi from 1955 and Jean-Pierre Melville's Le Cercle Rouge from 1970, which was almost a remake. We talked about it, but we feel like Jean-Pierre Melville kind of regretted letting Jules Dassin do that particular movie, because he was like, I really wanted to do that heist, so he just did it himself. Yeah, especially watching it back to back, and you just realize just the way it's kind of paced out, and then of course we have the basically scoreless 30-minute heist sequence in both of them, which are amazing. I mean, it was the first time I watched both of them, but specifically Rafifi just blew me away, and I can't wait to watch it again. It might be my favorite heist movie now. Yeah, it's one of the best for sure, especially when you take into consideration, as we did on discussion last week, all of the blacklisting history that went into the depiction of colleagues and friends betraying one another that happened in Rafifi. So... But so we haven't heard that episode. Again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. That was last week's bonus episode. But moving on to this week, joining us for the third time is a excellent film critic and author who we have spoken to before, and whose latest book, David Cronenberg, Clinical Trials, is an incredible must-read study on one of our Mount Rushmore filmmakers on this show. That guest is Violet Lucca. Violet, welcome back.
Hello. Very, very glad to be here.
Yeah, very glad to have you once again joining us. And before we jump into the films you've selected to talk about with us this week, we'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the inception of the book to any of our listeners who maybe haven't heard it. Because I have spent the last couple days, and actually basically the last week with it or so, and it is a very surprising and kind of unconventional tome-sized book on David Cronenberg, and it's not a chronological biography. It doesn't, really. There's, you do separate it film by film sometimes, occasionally, when it suits the structure of the book, but it's not like production chapters in chronological order in the way that people might expect. It has this very Jungian inspired framework to basically analyze the recurring patterns and themes in this very personal way, and it's really, really cool, and got me thinking about his work in a very different theoretical and philosophical way. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, well, I'm really glad to hear that. So basically I was approached to write a book about David Cronenberg by the editor of Little White Lies. And I got a bit of advice from somebody, which was, when you write a book, you can't just start writing a book. You have to write a book proposal that is approved. And this person was like, well, look, you're going to have to figure out the structure of this book at some point. So you might as well do it now, as opposed to later when it's going to be a fucking nightmare. And I was like, good point. So I was thinking of, different books, and I've like them structured and sort of, rejecting the sort of like the body horror thing. And I was reminded of Nightmare Alley, which was an incredible novel. And each chapter, it is about psychoanalysis. It's about the circus, but it's also each chapter has its own tarot card. So I was like, okay, well, maybe if I divide up the films sort of in these thematic ways, that would make more sense to me, as opposed to just sort of like a kind of boring chronological look. And new things might emerge from sort of looking at films from like the beginning of his career to the middle part of his career to the end of his career, and seeing how they come together in interesting ways. But there is a like a production history, like a straight up production history. I just wanted to get that out of the way.
Yes.
the persona part of the books. And that was a lot of fun to write, just finding all these insane little facts. Some of which
you had some details in there I wasn't expecting, but yes, for the production history heads, there is a brief section under persona that she has. If that's just the one section you want to go through, you can go through that.
Yeah,
but the actual films themselves are not like when you go through the rest of it and you break it into like the shadow and the animus and the self and everything like that. You aren't really going through the movies necessarily in a chronological fashion. You're more analyzing, which movies feel like they're in communication with each other regardless of time period of when he made it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's mostly just because I this isn't an academic book, it's sort of like a popular history kind of book, but I wanted something that would address stuff for people who are fresh to Cronenberg and people who are very familiar with Cronenberg. And I thought that this was a good way to go about it. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very excellent book, and when we were talking with you about like what we might be able to talk about when it comes to sort of in regards to it, we were like, David Cronenberg is obviously one of our favorite filmmakers ever. As a result, we have taken not left a lot of meat on that bone for you. So we were like, here's the movies we have yet to talk about. Violet, is there anything in here you think would work as a double feature? So what two films have you brought with you this week, and what was the sort of uniting factor between them?
So the two films I brought were Ed Emshwiller's Relativity and David Cronenberg's Spider. And Spider is kind of one of the two forgotten Cronenberg films, the other one being Butterfly, which I really hope to screen at some point in some city. We'll see what happens. But I thought of Emshwiller's film because Cronenberg always would cite him as one of the major influences. Cronenberg's been making films for over 50 years at this point. But nevertheless, it's always sort of the same group of filmmakers. And these were people who were active in the New York film scene of the late 50s and the 60s, right? So it's, Jonas Mekas is in there, Ed Emshwiller's in there. There's sort of these familiar faces because that was Cronenberg's first exposure to experimental filmmaking. It's what made him fall in love with filmmaking. And Emshwiller's film is just, once you watch it, you're like, okay, this is this is where Cronenberg gets a lot of his obsessions from, because it's about skin and textures and the body and organs and how these different sort of, working out philosophical / scientific concepts through narrative. And yeah, so.
With Spider, I'm assuming part of it was also going to be the connection with the actual, because Cronenberg did it a couple times throughout his career. Maybe people don't think about him as much, but I know that part of what you were trying to do with your book was move away. He's not just the body horror guy. He was very intellectually stimulated by psychoanalysis. This guy made a Jung and Freud movie, and Spider is like one of the sort of major depictions of that time that is like a little bit more sensitive of a depiction of schizophrenia than you might see other filmmakers make, where they would just be like, this guy just goes around being a crazy murderer, and there's something a lot more, sort of psychologically engaged and really sad about Spider.
Yeah, it was interesting actually to see. It reminded me of A Dangerous Method, which is, I assume, the one that you're referring to.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's like 10 years later or something like that he made it. But this one does have a little bit more of the, I guess, just the darker psychological elements of it. Like A Dangerous Method has it, of course, but just because I guess we're kind of diving into his past and we're going in between the present and the past, it creates just a more abstract psychological experience, I suppose. So. Well,
I mean, the other thing is that this, Spider came out around the time that A Beautiful Mind came out. And Cronenberg, talked about that in interviews, and he said, quote, "A beautiful mind is the Hollywood version of schizophrenia, and it makes it so attractive. You get to hang out with Ed Harris. You get to marry Jennifer Connelly. Jesus Christ. You get to hang out with Ed Harris. You get to marry Jennifer Connelly. You get to win a Nobel Prize and have an Oscar-winning movie made about your life starring Russell Crowe. So if that's schizophrenia, most people are going to say, yeah, let me have that. Whereas in fact, it's no laughing matter. If you need a distorted understanding of schizophrenia to make you feel better, I just don't understand it. End quote. So I think that's sort of that's the other, as opposed to, you know, I totally know what type of film you're talking about, where it's like, ooh, it's gross and gritty. But then there's also, you know, the way that Hollywood talks about mental illness, and it's completely between those two extremes.
People don't often know about that side of Cronenberg, but that happened a lot. He would very angrily see a movie and be like, I need to make the answer to that. I think about how The Brood was directly inspired by Kramer versus Kramer. And he was like, that's not what divorce is like. I just went through one.
This is what divorce is like. The Brood. Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, it's a movie about literally a family being torn apart. It's very, you know, it's one of those things where every once in a while Cronenberg, you know, he would go to those places people were afraid to go. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about these two movies and to talk about, you know, maybe the places that Cronenberg originated from, and one of the sort of later, more forgotten Cronenbergs that people don't discuss as much in his career. But that being said, I think we're going to jump right into it here. Let's kick things off. Let's talk about Relativity. Okay, we are talking Relativity, the 1966 experimental short film directed by Ed Emshwiller and starring a number of his friends, and I'm guessing family, because there's multiple credited people with the same last name there. And in his outlet, because there's no, normally we give the plot description to people here, I will just give you the outline description of the film to the Ford Foundation that he gave, that gave him the grant to make this movie, which is something that deals with subjective reality, the emotional sense of one's perception of the total environment, is sexual, physical, social, time, space, life, death.
This film is about everything, baby.
It's about everything. This is our first time on this show talking about Edmund Emshwiller, who, alongside obviously other experimental filmmakers and avant-garde visual artists that Violet was just mentioning, like the Mikus brothers. Kenneth Anger also was a big inspiration for Cronenberg. He had an incredible catalog of work that started in the 1950s, where he was just this incredibly prolific and like basically Hall of Famer cover art illustrator for pulp sci-fi stories, both in
unbelievable stuff. I was just gonna say, he, like, the range of art, like the different styles that he embodied and the different types of like scenarios he would use for these covers, absolutely insane. Absolutely.
Yeah, I looked some up, and they're in like he did it for magazines. He did it in paperback form, and basically like any sort of like retro, almost like H.G. Wells or Philip K. Dick you might find in like a vintage secondhand bookstore. If you just search like his name in sci-fi paperback, you'll get a good idea of what his very like saturated and atmospheric and surreal art style was. And you know, if you're ever browsing any of those sections at like an old bookstore and you look for EMSH, you have probably got your hands on one of his originals, because he signed them like that. He was a very, very incredible artist in that way, and later involved into doing like performance art pieces and things called like Cinedance, and obviously 16 millimeter experimental film, and was also one of the early experimenters with video and CG animation in the late 70s and early 80s, and even became the founder of the Cal Arts Computer Animation Lab, where he taught the the film and video in the 1980s, and also spent some time as a documentary filmmaker, which is where some of the nature footage element of this work comes in. I did read that apparently he shot some of the footage of Bob Dylan that appears in Don't Look Back, and I was like, man, this guy had just like one hell of a life, and Relativity comes out kind of in the middle there, and is just this incredibly sensual and subjective, just expressionist, science fiction, like inspired story, obviously. But at a certain point, I just kind of let go, and I was like, I think this guy is like experiencing life and floating around and, kind of having maybe an early version of what became the final section of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but done in this very like lo-fi kind of style where you really do feel the sense of alienation, you feel the sense of time, and obviously done in this very poetic and abstract fashion. But Violet, maybe tell us about your first experience with Relativity. I'm very curious.
Well, first of all, I have to say it's very interesting that you mentioned 2001, because there were two major filmmakers that visited Emshwiller, Alfred Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick, and he turned both of them down. Like they literally came to his house in Long Island, and he was like, no. But everyone else he was happy to work with. He was like doing, like you said, he was doing camera work for like everybody and his brother, but not the big fish.
Damn.
I like it's. I guess I'm always very fascinated by that scene, and especially especially who clearly has. He's expressing this sort of as I said before, it's expressing these philosophical and scientific concepts through narrative, but that narrative is entirely visual. So there's such a focus on figures, right? There's the figure of the human in particular, which obviously if you're doing commercial illustration in the 50s, the figure is the most important thing. And his interest in dance, I think, also, there's a little dancing in this, not too much dancing, but there's some dancing in this, also makes it like and the way the camera moves, I think it's just, he's somebody very interested in motion and capturing motion, and expressing things through motion. And I saw this sort of fascinating video essay that argued relativity has to do with Einstein's theory of relativity. That there are these things simultaneously occurring, but for one person, they might see it at a different time than another person, and they would experience it differently. And so therefore it's sort of like this multitude of meanings. And some of that is in here too, right? We get a little Plato's allegory of the cave. The man comes out of the cave, he comes into society, he's alienated, he makes woman, he travels the world, he travels through all these different things, and then, he goes back to the cave or to some sort of coffin, right? I don't know. This is not.
Yeah, that imagery is crazy. Some of the matching of imagery where you do get this like tomb-like, but also womb-like cave imagery, but then all of a sudden he'll be in this like void where he's in this like box that looks like it's been like drawn with chalk or something like that. That's also like a coffin, and those are the kinds of imagery he will jump between, and doing this in a way where it's just like it's very clearly there is some tangibility, and there's a lot of tangibility to some of the very specific close-up and textured imagery that we end up seeing. But even when he gets like more metaphysical, he is trying to do it, in this very lo-fi surrealist approach, but it is expressing these scientific and philosophical questions and anxieties and feelings about what feels like, anyway, on first impression, like, our minuscule kind of organic existence and our technological evolution within this much more vast cosmos. And it's an idea that you would probably see other science fiction storytellers do, but they would do it in a story about like rocket ships and aliens, and he would draw the cover art for that book, and it would probably be a really fun book. But his is like, how do I capture those same feelings, and maybe how do I even capture them more effectively through like just pure sensorial like image and sound association, like kind of triggering like a very base part of your mind where you just go, oh, that's repulsive, oh, that's beautiful, and like and getting at through more abstract form, establishing these kinds of concepts and objects and space-time and things that you've definitely thought about before, but in just this really pure cinema experimentation kind of way that I found really, really, visceral.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you guys say that, the 2001. I also thought the moment it opened, I was thinking of 2001 just because of the floating. I think is it a floating man or a floating woman? But either way, it's a human being in like kind of a clear coffin, and it seems like the camera is either drifting off further away from it, or it's drifting further away from us. Gave me like a real sense of loneliness. And it also felt like since it was the beginning, it felt like it was drifting away into whatever we're about to experience in
also that it had just launched, because there's like the ticking clock, like almost like and someone speaking in like computer programming code or something that feels almost like a liftoff sequence.
It's a countdown sequence. Yeah.
And then and also we were talking about how he uses motion a lot, and with this specifically, he kind of has this really cool use of the camera where he goes into really close up into things that would normally be very average size, just a human body, for instance, and makes it almost seem like you're crossing a giant desert, but it's just the human naked body, or trees, or guts eventually, and insides, and all of that. Like it's this constant exploration of life and death, and the kind of the physical world. There's these really cool abstract moments too, where he's doing that with the camera, but it's not. It's almost strange how people are acting. Sometimes they're just models, but then other times he'll be going through bushes and trees, and then all of a sudden a human face will be just looking right at the camera, and he'll move right past it. And it's just like these quick.
Then he'll superimpose the two images onto each other too, or something.
Yeah. He at one point he does this thing where he starts to kind of contort the body by doing a split right in the middle of the frame, and then kind of fading in the middle a little bit, and having the two things that should be symmetrical off a little, and kind of dancing, and it creates almost like a dysmorphia of the body in a way, but there's also a beauty to how fluid it all is. There's a lot of contradictions, which are very interesting and pretty.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell if you're inside or if you're outside. It's hard to know if you're looking at, the inside of something or the outside of something, and you're moving between animals and humans and reptiles and birds and then paper mache and rocks and all these different things that are just very, you're never really sure where the surface is. And when you're breaking through the surface, or if you're ever breaking through the surface. And again, I think, like, as you said, the choreographed parts where, man and woman are fighting each other, but it's also a little funny because because
they're literally fencing.
They're literally fencing. And then he rips like a little hole in her shirt and he exposes her nipple, and he kind of boops her nipple. It's like there's a sense of humor to it and a lightness to it, which I think all of those things, there's sensuality, but there's humor, and there's this sort of dark, like primordial part of our brains that are like, oh, I don't like this. That again, it's very much like, that's like the land that Cronenberg is coming from. Those are the things that he wants to touch. And I would say that probably, Cronenberg was a huge sci-fi fan growing up, unsurprisingly. And I'm sure he recognized, Ed Emshwiller's name from all of those, paperbacks that he had been consuming. And so it's interesting to see somebody, again, taking those ideas of, because like 50s sci-fi a lot of it was crap, but this was also sort of like the high point where you got like Robert Heinlein, you got, what's his face? J.G. Ballard knocking around. You got, you have a lot of like great, like now considered great. Well, L. Ron Hubbard. You have now a lot of, now considered great authors knocking around this genre that was sort of like lowbrow and disreputable. And they were doing things because they, in science fiction that you couldn't do in other genres. You couldn't have, like miscegenation, showing the end of humanity, sort of this exploring dystopias, like all of these things, and not just sort of like the computer turned on and it was cool, and which I feel like a lot of sci-fi is now, unfortunately. But with this film, I feel like it is. There's this sensuality and something biological and kinetic and pre-language in it that makes it, obviously it's, you hear like, oh, experimental film from the 60s, probably going to be a miss for me, but it's actually pretty engrossing, and and the ending comes, it is sort of like a narrative film in that towards the it builds toward this climax at the end, right? And and that the fact that the 3-act structure mimicked male orgasm was absolutely a point of conversation during the 1960s experimental film scene. And there were plenty of people who were not doing that, male and female, just doing completely different things. And so he, Emshwiller was sort of like embracing that and being like, yeah, you know what? This is about excitement. This is about eroticism. This is about me coming, I guess, is a way to say it, but it's like this ecstatic, this ecstatic understanding of the universe, of experiencing life, and of experiencing of understanding what relativity is, of understanding this concept and moving through it.
Yeah, well, and I think he really just is about really trying to locate this strange and sometimes ugly beauty and poetry inside all of these existential anxieties that the genre would bring up. But he's like, how do I, translate that into something that's kind of mesmerizing and psychedelic? And it does, alternate between, doing things that feel like scientific observation, but then also, getting into uncomfortable close proximity, texture of these things. And he is one of those guys where you feel like this is a thing that could be done narratively. Like if you did try to reduce this to an actual log line, which it seems like he did not try to do, you could be like, this is kind of like almost a here is a man who is a stand-in for the human experience, of mankind in general, and here he is on this very sort of surreal and universal speed run, basically flying through the human experience in this very sort of dreamlike fashion, tasting basically every facet of the condition of the earthly environments and subjectively observing the awe and the wonder and the nature and all of this, but from a vantage point of someone who has a little bit more distance and can move through it and can adjust the time of it. And so that's where you get the first section, which is again it's almost like a literal birthing thing of him inside this womb-like cave, and there's this metronomic tapping and heavy breathing humming that's scoring it. And as Jamie pointed out, you're observing the sort of rocky textures alongside these gory sort of innards of what appears to be his body, but I'm assuming is animals, and also images of wires, and then the erotic ones of sort of the nude women. But even when you're observing sort of the women, it is through this vantage point of you're burrowing through this tunnel. You're observing the contoured shape of her leg or her pubic hair, it's the surface of a foreign planet or something like that. And it's just, and it actually, speaking of the Cronenberg connection, it made me think about those really wide angle close-ups of the surgery sequences in Crimes of the Future, the way that you look at the corpse cam stuff in the new one, The Shrouds, that's going to be coming out for people to check out soon. The way that they shoot the coffin photography in that is very similar to how this guy's camera like moves along, a naked body like it's a mountain or something like that. And then when the man is like eventually born and we leave the cave, then it expands into things Violet was talking about, where it's like trees and flowers and grass and worms and animal carcasses. And sometimes you're like hanging out with an orangutan or a rhino or a monkey, but it's like a close-up shot sometimes where you're like, am I seeing like a real pig slaughter right now? And then before you're even sure of what you're watching, then all of a sudden you're looking at prison bars or a man walking around in a void, like using monkey body language and like wearing a bag on his head.
Like I laughed out loud at the part where it's like the pig slaughtering sequence, and you're like, wait, is this actually happening? And then it kind of moves through these other things, and you see like innards spilling out of something we don't even know what it is, and then eventually we get to like meat at the store, like
the supermarket, like deli counter, where you're just like, oh yeah, the biological organic meat that like births and unites us all. Here it is now on the shelves.
Because I think that was in a guy who wrote it's like in an Allen Ginsberg poem, sort of dedicated to Walt Whitman, and sort of talking about walking through a supermarket with Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman being like crying over the pork chops that are sealed up. And it is, I mean, I think that is a great image. Like some people, I definitely know there are people who are like, how, Allen Ginsberg is making fun of Walt Whitman. But if Walt Whitman was there, he would be horrified by this. Like, this beautiful creature has been slaughtered. And so it's like, you can read these things, they're funny, but they're also, two things can be true at the same time.
Well, yeah. Well, and that specific cut became a regular gag of horror films, when you would get like someone getting killed, and then it would cut to a comedic shot of like someone pouring ketchup on a burger or something like that.
Exactly.
Like it's just
yeah. It is interesting and
we're all meat
to compare the human body. He's often doing these things back and forth, like pigs feeding on the mother's breast, and then cutting to the naked woman's body, and then so there's almost like this thing of
vegan alert, by the way. I don't remember if we said that yet. Vegan alert.
There's kind of like a unison at first, and then it starts to show the slaughterhouse and how we're handling the meat afterwards, so that we're kind of still, I guess, in power, so to speak, on the food chain and everything. And that kind of is explored as the film goes, rather than just like right away. It's kind of like expressing the beauty and fusion of the world, like how we all are one in some sense. We're all part of nature. That kind of goes back to the shots of the human beings amongst the trees, or even the one in the cave, where it kind of looks like, because of how close up the body is and he's so well fit into the cave, it almost feels like he's a part of it, and you're almost like exploring a giant or something like that. But
or that
just
there's
as the
a biological
film goes, it
connection.
accents more on like the idea of decay and all of that. Even the score, like he'll do things where there's this kind of like hum that's done in just a normal register, and then he'll do the same thing again, but it'll be slowed down by like 100, and it just feels darker now, and it feels like more on the brink of death or something like that.
Yeah, it feels like whoa, whoa, kind of.
Yeah, and it recreates something you just watched, but in an entirely new context, and now you feel like you're kind of drifting away rather than being a part of something.
Because, I mean, I watched this I'm pretty sure I watched this a long time ago, but I rewatched it for this podcast, and, at home, and something that I tried doing was just breathing along to the parts that are just breathing and just seeing where that takes you. It's sort of like being in that, participating in the film in a way that, like you can kind of sync up with it. You can sync up with like the ideas, you can sync. Yeah. And it's sort of like, and like see how the images sort of feel differently, or how the experience of watching this feels a bit differently. But I say that to say, so much of this film is about, sort of when our man gets out into society, he's alone, right? Mm-hmm. He's walking, he's the one standing alone in a crowd. A cliche, but come on, it was the 60s, it was fine. Exactly. He's the one alone on the beach. He's just sort of moving through life, and he's trying to whistle, sort of hum a happy tune, but eventually it gets too hard and then it becomes distorted and there's this disillusionment. But at the same time, and I mean, obviously, like the sort of the ending where, maybe he's in a coffin or he's returning to the womb or there's some sort of biological process happening. There is this, it is kind of touching on that existential thing of like, we all die alone. We can explore the world. We can sort of have these amazing experiences. We can see the beauty of the earth from space, et cetera, et cetera. But then,
you can get erection point of view cam.
That's right.
Which is beautiful in its own way.
I've never seen a shot like that in my entire life. That was incredible.
You gotta
that whole section was maybe my favorite section, where it was just like when he's doing the existential, just the boner shot specifically. That was the only part. But when he's doing the existential like metronomic chant of like being like was and will be and was, and it's just these fluctuating shots of just, it's kind of like now sort of like multiple bodies now, and I wasn't sure if it was meant to be like literal multiplication or something, because it's actually after he has sex and it's after the part where he fences with his female partner and literally has a sword fight with her and all of that, and you start to get the idea of sort of evolution, because there's a woman, I think, eats a dandelion, and there's an image of a butterfly breaking free from its cocoon, and there's definitely a sense of like man is experiencing evolution and transformation and sex, and he's leaving the entrails in the cave behind, and he's starting to, like it's the first time we see a clothed woman when she's in a nightie, and like things are starting to develop, and I think at a certain point too, it's when he sees like the man hammering a rock, and he figures tools, which then turns into like an oil drilling rig. And filmed in this really like ominous sort of like low angle frame silhouetted against to make it just look very large and imposing on nature, but kind of still in awe of the sort of movement and the kind of rhythm of it. And that also then gets matched with like a meat deli slicer from kind of earlier. And you're starting to see the evolution of man and the advancement of technology, and you're just entrusted to be kind of implicitly, putting these things together, which obviously some of the obviousness of the symbolism of the imagery is helpful, but there's more abstract stuff in there too, where you're just like, where does the airfield fit in? Where does the parking lot fit in? There's a quality where at a certain point you start to see like a silhouetted sunset and like the moon being swallowed by clouds, and like anatomy art pieces and what looks like early like computer server rooms or like wiring and stuff like that as well. And it at a certain point he does go on a long rant basically about man's like tiny place in the infinite cosmos, literally just like throwing numbers at you about how many billions of galaxies there are, and
or how few generations have actually taken place since writing was invented and all of that, like how kind of young we really are in the grand scheme of things. He's just kind of throwing it all at you too.
How many sperms we ejaculate during intercourse? This is something he thought about a lot. Clearly, penises and sperm and male orgasm occur a number of times in the movie.
I almost forgot this shot though, and I can't. Maybe someone can remind me of the context of it. But there's a shot where someone is holding almost like a full skin. It seems like a suit of skin in a way. Do you remember what?
Are you talking about the doll when he's pulling the doll out of the rock, and it's almost like he's holding like a charred like fetus skin or something? Yes, is that what you're talking about?
It's just it felt like one of the more disturbing images, and I couldn't remember. It was in my notes. I couldn't remember the context of it all, just as it was all passing me by. But I was like, I remember thinking
for me that was like part of like the birthing imagery of like this guy's being birthed from the cave, and here's literally like a baby doll that's like been exploded in the rock or something.
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to the same shot he has. It might be a little later on where the beetle kind of comes out of its skin and evolves into the next, or it might be a butterfly emerging, something like that. But one sequence I also love, I could watch this honestly for hours, just in different locations around the entire world.
It's the orgy sequence where mankind is spreading. I'm
assuming.
Okay.
The human disease is
hell
spreading.
Of a sequence, I agree. I just really enjoyed the dude doing a little dance in all the locations. and
Oh,
he's
like
just
all the like exercise maneuvers that he's doing.
Yeah, well, there's one part where he's literally humming a song, and all he's like, there's a great shot where he's on top of a bunch of cars, and it's so filled up, like the parking lot, that you can't see anything else but the hoods of cars, so it just looks like he's on a planet of them. He goes onto the beach, and he's surrounded by people who don't know he's filming, so he's doing it guerrilla style, and he's just kind of dancing in the middle of the street, the middle of the beach. I'm like, I could have watched that for an hour. It was just the funniest shit in the world, just going from place to place, and it brought me joy, I guess is what I'm saying.
He was doing the original like Jackass hidden camera stuff as well.
yeah, there's some guerrilla
Candid
shooting.
camera was popular in the 50s, so I'm sure
that's
people
true.
were used to it. But I love, but I mean, what is, you know, despite the sort of loneliness and this, like the somber nature of some of the images, you know, if it's like a skeleton of a primate ancestor of humans, or an old sort of like an emotionless old man, or what have you, or just, you know, someone in prison, someone in what looks like a coffin. That
old man is not stoked about those kids playing.
They do a cool thing too, where they kind of like faded into his face, and it almost feels like two things where it's like these kids will grow up to become this, but then at the same time he seems like he's looking back at it, and I agree, he doesn't look entirely pleased.
Yeah, well, and like, you're right, like the superimposed dissolve is really cool, but weirder, and that I don't know if I've seen before, is when his head literally becomes the shape of the frame.
Oh right, yeah, that's kind of what I was referring to, but totally.
Oh yeah,
I was just like, that's it. It feels like you're really kind of in his head at that point, and you're kind of getting a true visual projection of like what he's thinking about. It's very cool.
It's this forced perspective of the camera's frame, right? Like the square the square of the bow legs. But what I was going to say is that, like, the ending, despite all this kind of grim stuff, acknowledging the sort of the grimmer parts of existence, you know, the last shot is of a guy, you know, just like teeny tiny on the top of it's probably a mountain or a pyramid, something. And he's just up there dancing, and he just goes, yeah.
And he goes, yeah.
And it's like, and it is just like, it is better. It's good to be alive, despite all of these different things and these multitude of things that are happening simultaneously, despite, you know, the limitations of our perception and our biology. It's so nice to be alive. So get out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to look at life. You can look at it like you are perpetually a tiny little subatomic particle that is going to disintegrate in, you know, a minute second of the timeline of the galaxy.
Let's go.
Or, you know, you could be a turtle flipped over on its back, unable to, you know, move or do anything.
Or carrying the universe.
You could have a slow motion orgy to psychedelic rock music and dance on top of a mountain.
Yep.
So
I choose.
You know,
to
I know
dance.
which one of those two I'm going to be.
I know it is like corny that it's like ultimately you could be like, yeah, live, laugh, love, dance like nobody's looking. Like it feels so corny, but this is like that sentiment is true. What makes it depressing
There's
is
something
that
powerful about coming to that idea at the end of what it is that he shows you, where you're like, we're all neat, we're all nothing, we're all, you know, like the fact that he will just he'd be like, in terms of pure scientific observation, I'm acknowledging all of this stuff coldly, but at the same time, isn't mankind kind of surreal and awesome, and like, you know, isn't it a miracle that it exists, and like, what is this? And like,
the accident of our existence is fundamentally good, actually. Like it's nice.
It really makes me laugh that we could say the Emshwiller is the OG live, laugh, love motivational speaker here, and he does it in the best way I could have possibly imagined. It's fantastic.
Yeah, because I mean, because what makes live, laugh, love cringe? It's the fact that somebody put it in that font and printed it up and put it in every Pier 1 across the country, right? Like that's what makes it depressing. Like the banality of it and the manufacture of it. But this is very much like, again, the inorganic nature, like the forced funness of that of those signs. And this is, it's so much just like
pure expression.
We're coming, the earthy. It's earthy. It's like, it's earthy. It's like some hippie who hasn't been, or somebody who's been at a rave who hasn't really, needs to re-up on their deodorant, giving you a big sweaty hug. And you're like, yes, this is nice, actually. Yeah. It's better than the alternative.
This is the kind of the visual representation of a big sweaty hug at a rave while you're just a little too blitzed out of your mind. Absolutely. It's a beautiful thing.
Thank you, Ed.
Yes, thank you,
Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
This is incredible.
Yeah.
I think like anyone,
it is.
I'm not much of a experimental film guy mostly because I just haven't watched a lot of it. I really do think I'd like it if I dove more into it. But I found myself to be attached to this right away, and I was just completely intrigued the entire time. Like it really was something I wanted to just kind of sit with. I like my notes are a lot more minimal than they usually are, just because I'm at a certain point. I was like, I'd get more out of this if I just sit with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're just dealing with like pure impulse and imagination here, I think, and with the skill to like really vividly, express itself, which is not something you can say of all experimental cinema, even if it's copying some of the techniques that you see in here.
Yeah. I also felt like it was clear. Like it's not like, I don't, you want abstractions and you want things to not be completely spelled out for you. I mean, it is an experimental film, but I still felt there was enough for me to latch onto that I wasn't completely confused and it was entirely abstract. I have watched a few of those and I'll like the visuals. I can kind of ride along with just how those make me feel, but there's nothing really emotional about it. And I actually found some moments here to be touching and and if not, maybe just impactful, because they were kind of like quick gut punches here and there with some of the decay and all of that.
Yeah, but also absurd, and he gives you the full spectrum of the human experience in about 40 minutes here. And if we're pivoting towards the reductive rating round, we remove all the words and all the nuance and reduce the movie to a number between 1 and 5. This one was a very solid 4 for me. Yeah. Like it made me really want to go down the rabbit hole and check out more of his stuff. And I think part of the reason he's so successful is because, he's someone who knew how to draw within the lines in the first place, like as someone who clearly had been in the commercial industry of like, here's what this paperback is about. Give us like a beautiful, colorful, image that kind of summarizes what the content of this book is, but will also like attract an eye. And I think being someone who's talented at that and someone who's clearly into science fiction and likely has read a lot of it and has, has some of the same philosophical and sort of scientific questions that those that material contains, but it was like, what is the most kind of lo-fi, liberated, sensual, abstract, poetic way I could express maybe those same ideas? He makes that transition like very, very comfortably. And we talked a lot about, the imagery, and there is a lot of, fantastic imagery, but also I found the sound design incredibly effective in this, and the use of metronomic voiceover and diegetic noise and breathing and humming that eventually turns into score in some ways. And I found the way that how that interacts with the imagery and sort of the avant-garde sort of shooting and cutting techniques that he's doing, it really did feel like it was activating like kind of like a primal or like a rational part of my brain, where I was like, oh, icky innards. And then I was like, oh, what, and I'm squinting trying to be like, what is the texture that I'm looking at? Yeah. And then it would like pull away and it's something else. And at a certain point, like, as you said, like I stopped taking notes. I just went, he is, I am, you can look at this as a movie about like a guy experiencing the human condition, and you could view it as literally like a guy floating through space and like being like, I'm looking at this thing, I'm looking at that thing, what is this? But it's that's the experience you're going through with it. And yeah, he does a really good job of sometimes being a little obvious with the symbolism, but I think in a way that's still incredibly viscerally effective, and sometimes being a little bit more, tricky with some of the things that he's doing, and being like, you're getting the idea of man's birth and evolution and technological process and the spreading through the orgy imagery and like all this kind of stuff, and then finding out the minusculity of what it is that of our place in the vastness of all of this. And I think just the fact that he's able to do this through pure cinema experimentation and really get at both the distance of I'm a scientific observer who's coldly thinking about some of these ideas that you would see in a science fiction story, but I'm also willing to be like, we're going to get uncomfortably close and intimate to these things at the same time, and finding ideas and impulses and contradictions in how we are born and how we die and what our experience in between that is, and the organic and the natural in its relationship to the mechanical and the technological, and the loneliness and alienation of being a tiny organism in this like incomprehensibly vast network that can be hard to fathom, but at the same time, like it kind of being a miracle and also something that, you know, it's the only thing that we know how to reckon with. So we're a bunch of impulsive little meat sacks that are going to go and do our thing and dance around and have sex and, you know, listen to rock music and scream yeah on a mountain. And I was just like, at a certain point, there's something strangely hopeful about this, where it feels like someone else would have gone in a very bleak and cynical direction with maybe some of these exact same ideas. So yeah, it worked a lot for me.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think this is great. I'm also going to for it. I just love the camera work. I love that it actually feels kind of like you're in this miniature spaceship going through Earth and exploring the body and exploring just animals and nature. And I thought that was an incredible thing to do. And then mixing that with these really abstract fades and kind of framing that he'll do, like the old man with the kids that we were talking about, stuff like that, I think is really, really cool. It's also interesting that it's like there are things that are beautiful and disgusting, but they're sometimes they're not discernible of like what you're really looking at. So you start to just question why you feel that way in the first place in this specific context, and that can be interesting as well. Instead of just him blatantly saying like why this is gross, you're just kind of you're forced to kind of question it yourself. I think the music and the score, like the humming and the constant breathing, the kind of like the breathing, especially giving this life to every situation that doesn't have any other sound built into it. You're kind of just locked into a point of view experience there. And it is reminding you that time is ticking, and that there is like there's a biological element to this that will decay and leave the earth. And even like as the film goes, like I was saying earlier, the music and the score, or like he'll use certain humming songs, for instance, and then kind of slow it down and make it more distorted, and it feels like there is a decaying aspect to that. And I also like that the human body is both. It's like incredibly tiny in some contexts, but then huge in others. Like when they're in the cave, the way that the man is lying down, it almost feels like he's fused perfectly with the cave and is as big as the cave, or one with it. But then there's other moments where obviously
he's a landscape you fly along.
Yeah. And then there's other things where it just feels like everything else is outscaling the human body entirely. So it's cool to kind of play with that as well. But yeah, I think this is great. And I did check out a couple more of his shorts just because they were pretty short and I had the time. The one was Sunstone, which I think we mentioned, which is like one of the first digital shorts ever made, and it's pretty cool what he's able to do with it. Some of it even the style of it looks familiar because you've seen it in like screensavers and stuff, but the way that he applies it to his the way that he does narrative and all that is really cool. And then the other one is Thanatopsis. I hope I said that correctly. It's incredibly strange. It almost has the same camera movement as it kind of flows in between these figures, but everything is incredibly distorted. It's black and white. There's a lot of like almost like these shaking bodies that you're traveling through. It really gets abstract with how things look too. It almost reminded me of some of at least the visual art of like Lynch or something like that at times.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah. So yeah, I think he's great, and I'm now a fan of Ed here. So check it out; it's great stuff.
Yeah, for you, Violet.
I will also for it, and it's funny. I was also going to mention Thanatopsis because of the Lynch connection, and I really, I don't know. Again, it's hard for me not to see this as, the title Relativity, as like a direct reference to Einstein, the thing that changed the 20th century forever. This acknowledgement that, unless two people are standing in, like moving at the exact same pace, the laws of physics are the same. The way light travels will be the same. The way sound travels will be the same. But if there's any sort of difference in motion or position, we will be experiencing things non-simultaneously. They will be relative, right? These things that, basically breaking the idea of reality open and the idea that there is a single objective reality, right? And I think that kind of goes to the semi-universality of this man, or the idea that this man could be on a universal journey, but also that it's completely, there are these digressions and weird little things, and us as the audience not really being sure who or what or where or when or why or how, like all the sort of basic, being completely unmoored and kind of floating in the space, in the narrative space of this film. And then also, I don't know, I didn't expect to be so kind of unnerved by it, but I guess that's sort of what, to go back to your earlier question about why structure it like this, my interest in Carl Jung sort of came from, identifying these things that are sort of pre-linguistic and they're just sort of handed down to us, and that sort of change and grow. These concepts of being afraid of I mean, I don't want to say it's like being afraid of the dark, because that's not really something he talked about, but these things of that nature, except for they appear in narratives, they appear in iconography across cultures, and that there's sort of, we, as different as humanity may be, and it may become still in the future with technology, there are certain things that will recur. And there's something beautiful to that. There's something sad about that. And again, this multitude of experiences, and knowing that, I don't know, multiple things can be true, can be this, and it can be the same thing. And that perception is just, I don't know, this sounds like a real 60s observation, but it's true. It's just like perception is faulty, and that, or it's malleable. There's not, your position.
I actually, that's a very, very perceptive, and I think it's actually a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about next too. I don't know if you intended that or not, but you like literally, I was like, you're now just describing Spider. Yes. And multiple fragmented realities existing at the same time, and perception being so malleable in the same way. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up here for Relativity. We're going to be right back, and we're going to be talking about Cronenberg maybe getting at similar ideas, but within the mind of a single schizophrenic man in the movie Spider. Stick around.
Who's nice webs? Spider?
What have you done?
All right, we are back, and we are talking Spider, the 2002 psychological thriller drama directed by David Cronenberg, written by Patrick McGrath, who was adapting his own 1990 novel, and starring Ralph Fiennes as a schizophrenic man named Dennis Clegg, who gets released from a psychiatric institution, and while temporarily staying in a halfway house, begins to kind of dreamily piece together a violent and traumatic childhood event involving his mom and dad that may still be haunting him in some capacity, or in every capacity. This is our 11th time. I looked this up. to be sure, talking about David Cronenberg and his tactile and clinical and erotic and fleshy and violent filmmaking style, and his career-long intellectual and philosophical interests in the body and its relationship to the mind and technology and to sex, its vulnerabilities, and not just ability but like inevitability to decay and mutate and transform based on whatever, sometimes it's an antiseptic environment, sometimes it's a very dingy one, like we'll see here, it's just he's a filmmaker who's at once sort of deeply at times afraid of and disgusted by the things that the body can do, but also one of the few filmmakers intrigued enough to kind of keep looking at it and probing at it and thinking about it and seeing what the mind inside of it is all about, and picking at it all like it's a scab, and very frequently also expressing everyone likes to talk about him and in the tangible sort of fleshy side of the things that he does, but he's always someone who's been very good at deeply psychological experiences and ideas, and kind of how those things manifest in the surface, and in this like a sticky tumor rising or something like that, and whether that's via his pulpier and more commercial genre frameworks like the early government-funded lo-fi exploitation sci-fi stuff we've talked about, the aphrodisiac slug high-rise movie Shivers, the murderous mutant children of like The Brood, or the gruesome telepath conspiratorial noir stuff of like Scanners, to arguably his peak run, I guess you could say, of like merging his hyper-specific fetishes with more accessible film forms, like when you would get into something like The Fly, where he was able to do the sort of tragically gruesome transformation, but in sort of like a romantic context, or Dead Ringers, where he got into that like kinky codependent separation anxiety. We have spent a lot of our time thinking about David Cronenberg. This one kind of comes at this one played more to me like when he was in that range where he was adapting some of the, I guess you could say this is also him adapting another author, but it's just it follows in that line of like, I think about him adapting Ballard or Burroughs or Don DeLillo or something like that, but obviously adhering himself to a very specific British writer here who apparently had a very sort of gothic fiction style. And obviously when Violet approached us about doing a Cronenberg inspired episode, we were like, well, I guess she's going to have to pick something on the marginal sidelines here. And Spider is a very often unloved and forgotten movie that came out between his 1999 conspiratorial body horror video game movie Existence, which is frankly pretty equally underrated, and features a belly button umbilical cord console video game, and also a fishbone gun. These things should be as well known as the Scanner's head explosion, in my opinion.
Something to do with like a butthole design on one of the things too.
Oh, yeah. The ports. Yes. The ports are absolutely supposed to be anuses. And,
you got to kind of lube it up a little bit. There's a whole function there.
And he's afraid to use his, but she shows him how. It's very cute.
Yeah.
It's also a romantic movie.
Yes, well, and that movie didn't do well for him, and this movie didn't do well for him, and part of that was what led into him doing the 1-2 punch of the kind of Canadian art drama versions of like American gangster crime movies with Vigo in the History of Violence and Eastern Promises, which despite looking like more normal movies, still very much incorporated many of his philosophical interests and troubling depictions of violence and family. And Violet, maybe if you could start us off by giving us some what were some of the things you learned about Spider when you were researching it for your book?
Well, I guess the big thing is that what a passion project this was for him. He basically got a script and it said Ralph Fiennes is interested in doing this, and he read it and he was very interested in it, and he had to produce it, and it was the first time he had to produce one of his own films, and it sounded like it just sucked. He basically didn't get paid for 2 years. All of the actors deferred their salaries. The crew was not paid for 3 weeks.
Damn.
like while they were shooting. Like, it was a very harrowing experience, but he believed in this film, and I believe part of that is because he, Spider, if the guy from Relativity is sort of the archetypal man or the archetypal human, Spider is the archetype of the artist, this person who is completely dedicated to their work, always carrying around, always scribbling down, always creating, always making these really elaborate things that mean so much to them, but to the rest of the world, nobody gets it. and in fact, people find it offensive. People think it's junk, and that he's just sort of this very shabby person, completely dedicated to his life, the starving artist, but also more than that, because I mean, the author said, he's like, Patrick McGrath, he's like, I never meant it to be that way, but he took it to this whole different place and said that, Spider is like the everyman. He is, this is the human condition. And so,
yeah, I was gonna say, but McGrath was maybe like, yeah, I did not expect a guy to read my story about this guy and be like, yeah, this is just like everybody. This is just if you're an obsessive and passionate guy, just muttering to yourself and kind of an outsider trying to express yourself, and you maybe you can't, and David Cronenberg is like, that's the universal man right there.
Yeah, no, I mean it is incredible, but I think it is, thinking of Relativity. I was, rewatching, and I was sort of, they really do line up, because what does Spider begin with? Spider begins with this tattered, moldy wallpaper. Mm-hmm. We start in the cave.
Like the texture.
Yeah, we start in this textured cave. We move out.
But the splotch stains look like these like Rorschach tests.
Absolutely.
Almost.
Yeah. But again, like the colors, patterns, like we have this very distinctive feeling of like when these are, what year these were made. And I'm sure if you're British, it's even more sort of like, oh yeah, no, I know. I'm familiar with that sort of patina and that color scheme.
That's that 50s wallpaper from, that side of town.
Yes, exactly. And then, Spider gets on the train. And again, he's the only person.
What a
not
shot,
moving.
by the way. That long shot of the people exiting the train and just arriving, and you're just passing by everyday busybodies, just going their separate ways, and then you just slowly pull up on Dennis and Rafe being very physically sheepish and fearful. And I love his outfit where he's like rocking 4 shirts, because I guess he's just like cold all the time.
Yeah, he's like a Steve Bannon.
One of the other guys makes fun of him. He's like, clothes maketh the man, and the less there is of the man, the more they need clothes. And he uses a sock like as a bag, and I will say the fine performances.
Yeah, keeps it in his
true too. Yeah, you were wondering. I was like, what's he about to whip out for a second? The first time I watched this.
Well, no, it's playing with that. It's playing with with what we expect a mentally ill person to do, right? And it goes a completely different direction in some ways. In other ways, it's like, oh shit, no, this is exactly what I thought it would be.
Yeah, I also do really like, just speaking on the intro where they're doing the kind of Rorschach test mixed in with like wallpaper and concrete and everything. It is just cool to establish that like we're going to have these personal subjective abstractions and interpretations of what's going on, but it's kind of grounded in a real place, and like with and specifically I guess like one major location and then a couple smaller locations, like the house that his parents lived in, the garden, and then kind of the city in general, the streets, and then I guess the bar as well, but that's not that introduced in the visuals of the introduction. But I just like that it's kind of a mix between what we're going to see with the subjective abstraction and then the grounded reality of the places that he's familiar with and has lived in, I guess, his entire life.
For anyone who hasn't seen it, like when we pick up with Dennis, he's a very clearly schizophrenic man who's just been released from a long stay at a psychiatric institution, and
like a
he's
Broadmoor.
essentially the reason. Yeah, and the reason he's pulling his letter out of his sock is because it has instructions on it, and it's going to take him to this halfway house in East London that's run by this very stern, and as the other sort of patients describe her, this very tyrannical landlady named Mrs. Wilkinson, played by Lynn Redgrave, whose facility is basically used as a first step back to the quote unquote normal world. And Cronenberg depicts this almost as like a purgatory block of like these decaying sort of like derelict sort of like London buildings and the kind of industrial parts of London that are kind of looming in the background. And, he, does things like, here's a story from one of the other former patients, telling a story about a guy stung by a scorpion hiding in his boot and died horribly and painfully. He's like, oh, well, welcome to this room. And while staying in this sort of rundown halfway house, kind of surrounded by this, lots of negative space and this kind of rusted metal bed frame and the stained and peeling wallpaper everywhere. He's like anxiously checking under his bed and observing this gas furnace and taking baths in like really dirty brown bath water that the woman is like upset that he doesn't want to like get naked in front of her for. And he's getting used to kind of this new routine, but also clearly he's brought something, with him, even though he's walking through the canals and going to the local diner. He's like scribbling in his diary and he's like doing puzzles, and you're led into an experience that you're not sure if you're in the present or if you're in the past or if you're hallucinating fantasies or memories or whatever with him. And Cronenberg incorporates it in this very casual sort of like waking dream that he walks around in, but is kind of almost like invisible to as well, like a ghost. And sometimes you will have scenes in a single frame of him watching his own childhood memory, or maybe fantasizing about something he thinks happened, but clearly he didn't experience because he wasn't even in the room for it. Right. And he is kind of telling or crafting a story of a momentous, he's building towards a momentous event that possibly led to and who he is now, essentially.
Because the thing is
kind of like is he discovering are you discovering a justification for certain things that we're going to see, or is it more of a realization of the truth, which is, it seems by the end, is kind of what we do end up seeing. But
or both.
Right. Yeah. And there is we were speaking on his earlier movies, I guess, just in the sense that it reminded me of The Naked Lunch a little bit, just because of that subjective kind of unreliable narrator in a way, just because there's those moments in Naked Lunch where he's so high out of his he's just high as a kite, so you don't really know like if what he's seeing is actually happening in front of him. And this whole movie is kind of based on that idea, because really you're locked into Spider's perspective, and because he's so, especially as the story unravels, you discover how unreliable of a narrator he is. It just feels it feels almost disorienting, but I think in a way that you're still kind of locked in to the experience. I didn't find myself frustratingly confused by any means. I think it just, for me, I guess it took a little bit to get into the like going from the past to the present and just kind of figuring out where, because you're in a very similar space the whole time too. They're in like almost the exact same locations a lot of the time.
Yeah, he goes back to his old neighborhood.
Right,
which
right.
Also
and
is
that's
clearly,
purposely done. So you kind of get lost in his subjective experience. So I really ended up falling into that and I liked that.
Yeah, because what is interesting to me is that so much of like you could watch this and just think that even because of the conventions of narrative filmmaking, you could think, oh yeah, this is actually what happened. Like his mom, there was this murderous sex worker who collaborated with his dad and killed his mom, and that's why he's like this.
Yeah, and you want to believe him too, like especially when you give him the character representing himself as a kid. At that point, when he's going through all this abuse and everything else, or watching his mother go through it, I suppose. It feels like you want to be on.
He gets chased around with a belt at one point, but I guess by
No, he
1950s
gets
childhood
slapped.
standards in the UK, that's maybe a little
Perfectly
that's a little
fine.
tame for the alcoholic plumber father Bill, played by Gabrielle Byrne in this, who, by the way, I think is good, and also the mother, who is this, you know, kind of viewed in this kind of gentle housewife mode, is Miranda Richardson, who also gets to play the dual role eventually as the prostitute character, Yvonne at the bar, who's the sort of more loud and blonde, and the one who gets involved with his father and maybe helps kill his mother with him, and really trying to lay on thick kind of the Madonna whore complex for any of the heads out there who are like, you know, this is a Freudian ass drama. I'm waiting for the mom to also be the prostitute, and to also, you know, him wanting to have you know, be the you know, seeing the mom in like her beautiful nightgown, but then also, you know, being
he's horrified
repulsed by her.
that. Well, no, he's
Yes.
repulsed. He's repulsed by seeing her in the beautiful nightgown, and the idea that his dad might like it, you know, and even the fact
It's fucked
that
up.
his mom is abused is not clear, and there's really no way for us to know if that is something that actually happened. Like, was she this put upon housewife, or was she you know, this woman who enjoyed going out to the bar with her husband, and her son, who saw her in this very Madonna like way, couldn't handle it and assumed that she had been transformed. Because
Exactly.
in the begin, towards the beginning of the film, we, you know, in one of these early recollections, we see like the young Spider, the young Dennis, go to the pub to pick up his dad, and there's the prostitute Yvonne there, and she's sort of like, well, if she's being loud, she sort of laughs at him, she flashes her boob at him, and you know, she gets like a little perverse thrill of it, but it's not the same actress that plays her. It's not what's her name?
Yeah,
Not Claudia Plummer.
it's not Miranda Richardson yet.
Miranda
It
Richardson.
transforms
Okay.
into her
Yes.
in like the next scene or the scene after or something. Yeah.
Let me try to say that again. So, you know,
Yeah, go ahead.
at that point, you know, it's the Yvonne who's, you know, flashing him, showing her boob, and kind of getting a kick out of freaking this little boy out, is played by a different actress other than Miranda Richardson, right? And then eventually that character becomes Miranda Richardson in this really grotesque way, with these completely fucked up teeth. She's very, you know, sexually free. She's really slutty. She's just sort of like, you know, ooh, you're going to fix me pipes. Like, she's just, everything is a double entendre, and it's just disgusting. And it's like uncomfortable and disgusting. But the things that he is...
Yeah, she's like a character on like an evil Mike Lee movie or something like that.
Yeah, but she's not... She you know, again, like thinking about it, rewatching it again, it's like, is she even a real person that he ever saw? You know, or is it this?
No,
this
I mean,
thing that sort
if
of
anything, you have a case that she's not, because at a certain point he starts imagining her as the like the caretaker woman as well,
Yes.
Mrs. Wilkinson, later on in the movie. Like, she also becomes Miranda Richardson, and is once again blonde and kind of speaks in a sort of similar tone, but she's saying lines that obviously like the landlady would be saying.
right. Right.
And so, yeah, like very clearly it's almost like, this is where the movie to me sort of played like just like a very dreary and miserable and like much more like low-key British version of like the first half of like Lost Highway, where it's like, are you in the fractured mind of a man who's like just trying to like cope with something, and therefore he's projecting these things around him and then trying to live inside like the fantasy a little bit, which is kind of like what the second half of Lost Highway is all about. And so that's kind of the mode I feel like you're in. What's interesting is that Cronenberg is much more subtle about it, in a way where he tries to kind of convince you that what you're watching is memories, or at least he uses the conventions of how someone might show you a memory or experience a memory, because to him it is. But at a certain point, he is very patiently building his way towards, you should be a little bit more distrustful of the information that he's providing you with, and he layers in through this sort of complex editing techniques and casting techniques to really highlight the construction and the fabrication of what it is that we are experiencing. And that is this just a boy who never grew up, projecting all of these awful things that, he, of the adult world, and trying to rescue the image of his mother, and then constructing a world where he can save her through some sort of violent Home Alone contraption using rope that's kind of like a spider web, because his mom tells him a story of a spider. This is the stuff I wasn't maybe 100% sold on. I think this is maybe a little bit maybe from the source material, but I'd have to read it to say for sure.
And it might work almost. That stuff might work less visually, or you might have less of a feeling of Home Alone if you were to read it. Like it does feel, kind of like an artistic expression of what he's about to do at the same time. And so, but I get what you're saying when he pulls the string and you're like, it's been leading through floors, and he, and
it's like triggering the gas and stuff like that. And then I was like, oh, and his nickname is literally Spider because of the story that he told. And then also, maybe his literal obsession with spider webs comes from there, but also maybe it's a symbolic use of, look at this, this intricate web of a story he's made. And, it's a little writerly for me. I do think, but I do think that the same movie, like in less sophisticated hands, I think that this movie is like one of those psychological puzzle box movies with like a trendy, bleak twist ending, and it's like not very good. And I think within Cronenberg's hand, who's very clearly passionate about it and saw something that even the author didn't see in the material himself, I think he puts in a lot of work to, make this not specifically and very pointedly, as Violet already laid out his own quote about it, like not make it the mental illness exploitation thing that I think on some level this, this material might have been. I'm not going to say it is because I haven't read it, but I think Cronenberg has an actual intellectual interest in this stuff and in the illness and how to depict it and how to sympathize and how to depict an outsider and how to, psychoanalytically, extract an actual haunted, paranoid, gothic mood out of all of this and say something interesting about it.
Yeah, and the thing is too, if he didn't convince you of it being a legitimate memory, something that a reason that he would be going through this kind of torment, it's what creates the empathy and the sympathy for the character. Obviously, if it's just revealed in right away of like this is just what happened, he has unfortunate schizophrenia, and it kind of created this delusion, and it resulted in the death of his mother. This is trying to deliver you on this the feeling that he has, the same disorienting and confusion that he's going through, where he doesn't really understand that that's what he's doing. So in a way, you could think that that's maybe. And even I felt it a little bit by the very end, where it feels a little bit manipulative, and it kind of has that pull the rug out from under you, and you're like, this was actually this the whole time kind of thing. It's not the same, not exactly the same as like it was a dream, but it still feels a little bit like that here and there. But I think like what Cronenberg does really strongly is what like you said, just focusing more on this kind of subjective point of view and why it is meaningful to him. Spider, Fiennes' his character. And there are still a lot of confusing moments that I think that work, like where it's like, is the possible abuse that he could be remembering actually legitimate, and it's kind of caused him to learn this almost misogynist behavior, is like that, like Yvonne kind of the personification of like the dislike of women, or even the possible cheating he did see from his father. It's all the thing is that it all gets kind of jumbled on purposely. But I like that the thoughts are there, and it creates this idea that even though he's an unreliable narrator, there might be hints, droplets of truth in there.
Yeah, well, because I mean, it also to fundamentally get at the question, is it really his mother he kills?
Mhm.
Because, you know, at that final scene where he's like, you killed your mother, it feels very strange. And
Yeah.
it's like, if he was to sort of avenge his mother, would he kill his father or would he kill this woman who has replaced her? Like, again, it's like, it leaves you in this very strange, like, again, like he wants to push the blame off onto this woman, this other woman who he can't help but fantasize about because there's something in him that makes him, he's attracted and repulsed by this woman, right? But watching it multiple times, you sort of begin to, things just feel very differently. Like every time, you know, you watch it, you know, the scene where they're at the allotment garden and Spider is like, you know, you murdered her. You're a murderer. And his dad slaps him. And then his dad is just like, wait, what are you talking about? And you can tell, like, the way Gabriel Byrne plays it, he's just like hurt by the fact he can't communicate with his son. Like, he's somebody who's not emotionally developed and very, very much, but you can still feel this pain. And he's like, you know, you spend too much time alone. You need friends. Like, you know, when I was your age, I had plenty of friends. Like, a boy's got to have his friends, right? And it's you know, again,
why don't you go down to the bar and get drunk and have some woman like jack you off under a bridge
Yeah, like a real.
and throw your cum like into the camera that's like in the canal.
Because I mean, that's the thing. Because that's the thing, right? It's like you do feel bad you can feel bad for his father, right? Like in this, like ultimately, if you understand what, again, like it's still, Spider is still very much like a little kid. And he can't ever not be a little kid. But also he's a murderous kid, right? And when he's being driven away, when he's being driven back to sort of like the Broadmoor facility that he was at before from the halfway house after the caretaker lady wakes up and sees him hovering over her bed with a ball-peen
With, like, a
hammer.
hammer, right?
Which is very phallic. Very phallic ball-peen hammer.
Yeah.
You know, his ass is going back. You know, it's sort of like it blurs the past him looking out the the car window with the present of him looking out the car window. And there's this figure at the window who is looking down at him. And this is the final shot, right? This figure of an older man looking down at him as he's being driven off. And it looks like, you know, the sort of the older resident at the halfway house who's sort of, you know, talking about like these great colonial adventures and how, you know, clothes make the man, et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah, he has one of my favorite stories that sets up the flashback to possibly how he had killed his mother when he says that great story about how gas is like such nasty stuff. He's like, I knew a man once, he put his head in a gas oven and then he turned on the gas, but then he changed his mind. But his head was stuck. There was nothing he could do. And you know, and then that results in him kind of getting paranoid and thinking that he's like smelling gas in his room and tying himself up with like the newspaper stuff. And it starts cross-cutting like his kind of dilapidated surroundings with his escape into the memories and, you know, both of his parents, but also his time like in the asylum as well, where he witnesses like another patient having a violent outburst with a broken piece of glass and like considers, you know, slitting his own wrists with it briefly. And he gradually and, you know, building towards the cross-cutting of the traumatic event of, you know, turning out that, he's obviously briefly thinking about bludgeoning this Mrs. Wilkinson in the head while she's asleep. And he's remembering weirdly his father, you know, bludgeoning his mother in the head with a spade, who catches her having sex with the prostitute and burying her body. And, you know, then bringing Yvonne into the house and attempting to, you know, gaslight him into believing it is his mother. Though one of my favorite details is that it's like not very very well. It's like Yvonne straight up like acting like a bad stepmom character and saying like, yes, we murdered your mother. Like, get over it. You know, I'm your mother now. And like all this kind of stuff. And her exaggerated performance is kind of like some of the first hints that like this is a conjured like boogeyman type experience. You know, it is. And or that surreal moment where she serves like raw eel for dinner and like Gabriel Byrne like licks his lips. And I was like, okay, he's very clearly like, this is like the most evil woman who's ever lived. And she's not real.
And you could argue, at least until everything is revealed, it could be almost like, you know, what he was imagining her as. It's like, this is the type of food that she would give me. You know what I mean? And it would be this almost kid-like exaggeration of what you would you would receive from an evil stepmother. But unfortunately, that is kind of revealed to be untrue. There is some,
because maybe he's living with two people who, you know, killed the only person in his life who he loved, or maybe he's just like, I'm seeing my mother as two totally different people, and you know, I am gonna get rid of one because I don't like one.
Because I've seen this one side of her, and now I can't unsee it. But what I was gonna say is that the old man who's sort of who is maybe a fellow resident or you know, at the halfway house. It could also be his father as an old man, right? That again, he's sort of seeing, you know, many years later, you know, this, he doesn't have that many figures of, you know, like male authority in his life, right? And as soon as he comes into the halfway house, this old guy saddles up to him and he's sort of like trying to tell him how things are and like this, that, and the other, right? He started trying to guide the boy and he fails, right? He ultimately fails, and just like the way his father fails. So it's like, just as he is, he's a boy and he's also this very, very broken man. It's also like, you know, there's his father and there's this resident, you know, just sort of forced to look down at him completely, you know,
like he's just
impotent to help.
He's just
stuck in this loop.
This like child cycle of just thinking. It almost like it connects to even the way that the nurse turns into, or the woman that's in charge of the halfway house turns into Yvonne too. Like it almost feels like because of that, like that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with his father or family or mother or anything like that. It's just another woman that's kind of, I guess in his mind, oppressing him or like just has more power than him and can kind of control him. And it feels like he then transfers that energy into whoever's doing that. And it does seem, because both examples are women, that it is focused on that. There's kind of a misogynist aspect to it in some regard. But I find that interesting. Like the nurse is just seemingly that's the only connection that they really have, is that it's just this person he feels is not really related to him or connected to him or should have that power over him, has it. And he turns her into this more evil entity to kind of justify what he's going to do. But because he has the schizophrenia, that's where the sympathy comes from, because he doesn't realize he's doing it at the same time. And that's, I guess, what Cronenberg's playing with throughout, of course. So,
because you understand why he's naturally kind of sheepish and fearful, and you're kind of, you know, you're walking through the nightmarish imagery in the same way that he is, and through this very, you know, sort of hauntingly austere, like kitchen sink, almost sort of like derelict look to the entire thing. And, you know, the way that it's cut together is obviously in this very sort of like fragmented and dreamy and repressed fashion, where you are like, anything can become anything at any moment. You understand his confusion. I love how frequently he'll watch a scene and he'll hear dialogue from the memories of other actors, and he will just literally start like muttering to himself, like, and like repeating them. And it's like the only lines of dialogue that like Fiennes gets in the entire movie. Like it's almost a silent performance. It's really impressive in that way as a regard. And so like, I think because Cronenberg is so sympathetic to what it is that this guy is constructing in his mind in order to cope with these really, bleak, concrete, grim sort of realities. And he understands someone trying to escape from them and maybe someone trying to change them into something else. And on a certain level, I think this is like despite all the sort of ugly texture and the claustrophobia in the sense that, you know, you're inside the, you know, a sick mind, there's something very sort of paralyzing and heartbreaking and kind of agonizing about, you know, the perspective that he's taking on. And I think that is Cronenberg, I think, finding something deeper within, you know, the sort of structure of what it is that he's adapting.
And there's what's interesting too is he'll still have, even though we know where this ends and kind of the truth of it all at this point, there's these moments that really, again, I'm kind of wrestling with it, whether they almost feel manipulative on a second go, or if this just kind of, it might be both even, it just kind of works to solidify this sympathetic viewpoint we have of Spider. But like there's the scenes where, you know, his father denies what's happening and that what he sees and what he feels he's experienced, and he goes out and sees the garden and he just looks down and he's just like, I'm sorry, as a child, like looking down at what he thinks is his mother's grave that a, you know, prostitute from the bar helped his dad kill.
Well, yeah. So right after telling Gabriel Byrne that he actually doesn't believe he's a killer anymore.
Yeah, right.
So it's actually him manipulating that and being like, let me back into the house, please. I believe you. And then also clearly like lying and being let back into the house so that he can make his little, you know, rope contraption, this like, you know, this like, Rube Goldberg machine that is going to set off the gas in the house and literally kill his mother. It's and that's where you start to get a little bit more, I think, like, oh, his imagination is actually going to have more consequences of what's happening here, but it's still ambiguous enough that you're still not totally sure what happened. I think like Violet wrote really strongly, I think, about this in her book, where she brought up that it's not just that he's an unreliable narrator, but the way that Cronenberg is like messing with your perception, he's making it difficult to tell at any given moment whether you're watching him, and as we've discussed, like realizing his own guilt. Is this a cyclical coping mechanism that he's invented? Is this just a revelation he has once every few days or weeks or years? Or is this a completely fabricated story to make sense of something else? Yeah. Is any of it real? I feel like you are left with no idea exactly what. And I feel like that's actually partially what's keeping me from, I think, totally loving it. I think the ambiguity is really interesting, but I think it was also one of those things where I've watched the movie twice and sometimes I'm like, I'm still not sure I know this or I completely get this one. Which is kind of the boat that I find myself in. But I do appreciate everything that Cronenberg brings to it. Like, it's beautiful. The performance is great. He's doing a lot of really complex things and, you know, conveying a lot of complex feelings and ideas through the form. And so, you know, there's a lot to like about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would
agree.
say,
and I also like, I don't know if we spoke on it too much, but just the camera work that he does, where every bit of industrial piece of like a construction or anything in the background is so overlooming. It does feel like, it feels like kind of Eraserhead in moments where, you know, he's just kind of walking around in these, what seems like almost abandoned factory buildings and alleyways and stuff. It just feels like, you know,
that's Peter Shishitsky, the God, which, by the way, Violet, how was it talking to Peter Shishitsky?
Oh my God, it was so nerve wracking, but he was so lovely and very smart. And I wish I had found, because I always, you know, to prepare for an interview, I always like to read other interviews that the person has done. Obviously, it's called research, but I wish I had found, I don't know. I wish I had found more stuff where he was just sort of talking about craft. But I highly, highly, highly recommend the podcast he did with that Peter Shishitsky did with the Coen brothers cinematographer Roger Deakins. I highly recommend Peter Shishitsky's appearance on Roger Deakins' podcast, because it's just like two old heads just like talking and just being like really friendly with each other, and just it's incredible, like the amount of like wealth of information I got from that. And also it's just like you could tell they're friends, so it was nice. But yes, I loved talking to Peter Shishitsky. I originally asked him about
the hell out of this because he was the one who became his collaborator after Mark Irwin did the 80s run with him. So he's like Naked Lunch, M Butterfly, Crash, Existence. Like if you're wondering about the how the look kind of shifted from the more like 80s era where this is Peter Straczynski is a huge part of that. And honestly, he was asked to do a lot of different looks for him.
Oh yeah,
like, the difference between M Butterfly and Crash is pretty extreme, but also there is there's still that sensuality to both of them in different ways.
Right. Because I mean, the first film that they worked on together was Dead Ringers. And obviously Dead Ringers is sort of like this real turning point in terms of style and sort of how things unfold. So yeah, I would absolutely hugely influential. But yeah, but also I would just like to quickly note, thinking about this in relation to something like Relativity and Ed Emshwiller's sort of interest in movement and dance, just how incredible, Ray Fiennes' movements are and how like they are, they're finely tuned. They're not mannered, but they are absolutely believable, right? And and Cronenberg always tells this story about how he did some screening somewhere, and this woman came up to him afterwards, and she said, "How did you know about the bathtub?" And Cronenberg goes, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "My son is schizophrenic, and he sits in the bathtub the exact same way that Spider does in the film." And he was just like, "Oh, okay, no." But I mean, that there are these little things of these ways of moving that sort of show that, maybe something is going on. You're neurodivergent in a way. You're maybe not connected to the same sort of physical reality that other people around you are. Like there are these ways of expressing that through movement, and Ray Fiennes did it.
Yeah,
without
even having his character be in the actual physical space of the past makes it seem like it could only be entirely unreliable, and like there could be fabrications here, just because it's not like you fade into a flashback of the memory or whatever. You just kind of walk into the past, just very naturally, fluidly.
Yeah, but I was going to say that's also what feels like kind of grounds it, right? Like his lived in sort of way that he moves through them is at total odds with the, sort of like the almost the philosophy of the editing structure of the movie.
Yeah, he's constantly doing both of those things at the same time, it's like that is where Cronenberg, I think, shines in this, and probably where he elevates it.
Because it's like rigorously controlled, camera movement, and obviously this really great physical performance, and then finding fragmentation through this kind of seamless, subtle blending of present memory and fantasy, but like not simply through editing. Sometimes it's like in a single frame. Yeah, like sometimes it's just including the childhood version of himself and Fiennes in the same frame, like and him looking in on it, and it's just there's a lot of very tasteful, careful, minimalist craft that's taking place that really does, I think, suit the story that's being told. Yeah. But yeah, if we're maybe once again pivoting towards reductive rating round on this one is lands more in like the high 3 territory for me. I do like it, and this was my second watch, and I actually things that I had issues with on my first watch are started to actually kind of go away a little bit. I think partially because I saw what Violet was highlighting, which was Cronenberg's just passion for it. Like it makes me really want to read the book, because I would love to see some of the decisions made in adaptation, and especially with Violet just clarifying that the author was even like a little bit surprised at some of the perspective he took on the material, and was like, I literally didn't even see my own material that way. It's almost like he spidered it himself. He was like, I have a very different memory and fantasy of what your material could look like. And I think that I sense so much of that. And I think there's just a couple things about it where I kind of go, man, I could, and I don't know if it's even fair, but I think I just like see the worst version of this that could exist, and I wonder if the book is the worst version of this that could exist.
There's a glowing potato in it.
Yeah, and I don't. It's really not fair. It's really not fair. I do think I like this quite a bit, and I do think Cronenberg is, he's a genius, and I think he was able to find a lot of incredible things in this that another filmmaker wouldn't find, and I do think that he is someone who, he's directing Fiennes in this very natural way, who is playing the character very tortured and sheepish and nearly wordless, but in this very lived in fashion. And Cronenberg has, an actual intellectual interest in this guy as an outsider and what's happening in his mind, and sympathizes with it, but also sees the sort of subjective point of view and the mood he can get of this sort of like shattered, sort of drifting experience for him to emotionally play off of. And I do think that all of his usual collaborators here, we mentioned Shishitsky, but also the editor, Ronald Sanders, composer, Howard Shore. Unfortunately, the only Carol Spire didn't do the production design for this one. This was one of the few, I guess, she couldn't do, because she's still working with him today. She's like his most lifelong collaborator. But again, all of these collaborators, I think, are still at the top of their game. Like the dingy, derelict look is great. The, sort of like austere British kitchen sink, like just like having like a satanic Mike Lee like look to the movie, I think is really fantastic. And again, the control, the fragmented kind of structural blending of present memory and fantasy is all fantastic. And yeah, I think there's a lot to like about this, and a lot to get into the the sort of the Freudian perspective, and the the all of the sort of just tormented, barren, sort of gaunt, wounded atmosphere that he is capturing. And yeah, I think part of me just goes, there's something that feels a little trite in the material to me, and I do wonder that if the twist ending is maybe a bit more tasteless in the book version. But here Cronenberg puts a lot of energy technically, and I think intellectually, and in the sort of natural and felt performances to make this a lot more than just like a dreary, miserable sort of like puzzle box movie, even if it also is effectively one of those if you like that. So yeah, yeah, very solid 3 for me.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you. I think it's strong because Cronenberg, I think, elevates a lot of these ideas, and the sympathy for what does end up being a killer, I think, is what makes this work, oddly enough. And he cares about the delusion of the character and what it means to Spider specifically. Like, he doesn't want,
and he's impressed by the construction, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
What an artist.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. He doesn't want to be a killer. This is just his reality. It's just, unfortunately, his reality is literally no one else's, and so no one's going to understand him. He's his subjective reality is completely foreign to anyone else. And so I like that Cronenberg is creating the space so that you can at least understand his mindset. That being said, it's still the ending where it's kind of like, he was a killer, and none of this had a lot of, I guess, truth to it, truth to him, but not truth to, I guess, the reality of the situation. Anytime a film does that, it does piss me off a little bit. Sometimes it really upsets me because it just feels like a cop-out. I think that Cronenberg does the work here, so it doesn't entirely feel like that. And in fact, it mostly doesn't feel like that. It's just, I don't know, when Gabriel was looking at the boy and just kind of like, you killed your mother, and everything else is kind of reframed from there in a sense. That still bothers me, but maybe it wouldn't on the second watch, and maybe I can kind of dive more into the whole just it's again based on the subjective experience and kind of why he's feeling this way. So I'm still wrestling with it. I do think I need another rewatch, and it would be interesting, like you said, Josh, to read the book and just see how that ending, if it is the same ending, connects to what he does before that, because I think that's crucial. That's why I think this works again. So, and yeah, I also love the fluid traveling between past and present rather than this like fade away flashback or something. It really, again, sets you into the Spider's experience, and it again, it's crucial to. Yeah,
we're done with black and white and sepia tone. Just start blending start doing flashbacks through blocking and framing.
Yes. It is I love it. I think it's a great way of doing it. And again, it's connected to why, like the experience that this film's trying to get you in. So it all connects in that way. I don't know, when a film pulls the rug out from under you so quickly like that, it can upset me, but Cronenberg takes his time, so I can't necessarily argue that it's incredibly quick.
I would actually argue it's maybe the slowest, most patient rug pull in movie history.
Yeah. Sure.
To the point to the point where you kind of see it coming.
Oh, for sure. In some regard, you definitely see it coming. I think what I was looking for, because it spends so much time with him, that maybe there would be more reason for what he's doing rather than just schizophrenia, which at the end of the movie, it feels like that is what it is. There's these hints.
No, if anything, it's really bleakly like, yeah, there's no escape. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It feels incredibly hopeless. And so I was kind of like, I'm almost trying to look for, and I would on my second watch.
The opposite of Relativity. It doesn't have Ralph Fiennes being like, yeah, like on a mountain.
Yeah.
That's what it needed.
Yeah, definitely not. I'm almost kind of looking for, on my second watch, if I ever get around to it, is kind of these little hints of things that could be connected to maybe why a child would make something so elaborate or something worse off than it was. Little hints of abuse or something like that. And again, you don't need to justify everything in a movie. I understand that. It felt like really hopeless by the end of it, to a point where I was like, damn, I guess he's just screwed. Okay. So anyway, it's kind of a minor thing. I think I just need to retackle it. So yeah, strong 3.
Yeah, for you, Violet.
I'm gonna give it can I give it a 4.5?
Hell yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because I really one of the big, so in addition to sort of these, I think the thing that Cronenberg found universal about Spider is that, memories, we create our own memories. It's, we revise our own memories. Not everybody sees this. We can experience the same event and not see the same thing. It can change. And we can, through things like therapy, just life, you come to understand different points of your life, periods of history in your own life in very, very, very different ways. And everybody does this, right? And that's a key component of our identities. There can be an obsessive nature to it, and just going back and be like, God damn it, I really should have told that woman off, or God damn it, I should have apologized. Like all of these, there are many different ways that we do that, and we sort of come to terms with things, because ultimately, you have to come to terms with things, or otherwise, you're gonna want to kill yourself. Like it's just like one of those things where it's just like you have to learn to live with your mistakes and with your successes and bad things that you have done. Can Spider do that? Unclear. But that universal like creation and recreation of memory is what attracted Cronenberg to it. Because obviously identity is such a huge part of all of his films as well. So, and I think that this is...
He really went on a tear there with Identity. The next one's History of Violence, which is all about crafting your family identity and stuff, right? Like,
and Eastern Promises too.
Eastern Promises too, yeah. He was like, this was the mode he was in. He had a lot of thoughts about crafting his own identity.
Yeah, because it's like, Severance, right? What are we? Are we only our memories? And like, if we think about how different, there are different types of memories that can potentially influence our behavior, et cetera, right? So if we're thinking about that, if we are our memories, memory is super important to, God damn it, cat. Oh no!
She disagrees.
She clawed the shit out of my leg. She jumped up. Oh, you're getting old. She's getting old. She's getting
We're
old.
keeping that one in for sure.
You just I blow out the mic. Ah!
Some guy with a subwoofer kills himself just right then and there.
Don't listen to podcasts on subwoofers. Yeah, but
this is the podcasting life. But yeah, no, Violet, I liked everything you said about memories. It reminded me. Obviously, David Lynch has been on the mind for a lot of people recently. But thinking of Lost Highway again,
it feels
that line
fucked up.
about how.
It feels
that
he doesn't. David, the other David, and not David Lynch. Ow.
Yeah. But I was thinking about that line where they say that Bill Pullman doesn't have. He hates videotape and he doesn't have any video cameras in the house because he likes to. I don't want to remember them how they happened. I want to remember them how I remember them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Spider very much lives by a similar philosophy, I think, throughout this movie. But yeah, thanks so much, Violet, for joining us. I think that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode. And this was Relativity from 1966 and Spider from 2002. Thanks so much for joining us, for bringing these films. Once again, the book is David Cronenberg, Clinical Trials. Please buy it from wherever you can. We will have a link in the description for you guys to get it. But Violet, is there anything else you want to say about it or anything else you want to promote while you're here?
Well, I will be in Toronto at some point, and I will be in other. I will be in other locations around the country, because obviously The Shrouds is coming out, so I'm going to be hitting the road, assuming that it is safe.
Go.
David
Cronenberg book tour with Violet.
assuming it's safe to fly. I don't know if you've been following the news. Elon Musk getting involved in air traffic control, not good. Seems to be happening, whatever. Maybe I'll drive.
Relationship with America and Canada has never been better. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, but I will, follow me on X and Blue Sky and Instagram and fucking Xiaohong Shu and all of the platforms you can find me, and I will keep you up to date about that. And hopefully, I will be writing another book very soon. I really enjoyed
Yes, and please do everyone buy the book. It is great. Go to the link right now. Go check it out. Please buy it. It's very good.
Thank you so much.
For our listeners, we're going to be back in 1 week's time where we are going to be going, as Jamie alluded to, we're going to be going sort of like B-side Stephen King mode. We're going to be talking about George Romero's The Dark Half and Toby Hooper's The Mangler, two sort of like horror legends who were still around in the 90s who were being hired to do these commercial Stephen King adaptations. Both are very strange, but both very fun. And then that's going to be next week over on the Patreon exclusively, obviously. And then in 2 weeks' time, back on the main feed here, we're going to be having a special guest on where we're going to be going aliens mode. We're going to be talking about a movie called Communion and another movie called The McPherson Tape. And I have not seen either of these movies.
I love Communion.
Sweet.
I love Communion.
Oh, okay. There you go.
It's funny thinking about Stephen King adaptations and thinking about David Cronenberg, The Dead Zone, where Walken sort of plays like a normal guy who gets like transformed into Christopher Walken. Communion is very much like he's trying to be like a normal dad, but he's still Christopher Walken. But I'm very excited for you to watch it. It is a crazy movie.
Sweet.
Yeah, we're very excited. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going alien mode. Look forward to that. But that being said, I think that's going to wrap it up for everything this week. Thanks so much for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy, everybody.
Keep it sleazy.
Hell yeah.